The town of Brookfield was quiet, with tree-lined streets and large houses that held secrets behind their doors. Margaret Dawson had lived in this town for over 2 decades, sharing a home with her husband, Richard. Their marriage had been steady, without major conflicts or concerns. Margaret believed in routine, in the life they had built together, and in the man she had trusted for 20 years. Richard was a respected architect, known for designing some of the most elegant homes in the city. He worked long hours, often coming home late. Margaret never questioned his schedule. She spent her days managing their home, attending social events, and volunteering at the local library. Their only child had moved away, leaving them with an empty house and quiet evenings. Margaret accepted it as part of life, believing they had reached a phase where comfort replaced excitement. Everything changed on a cold November evening. Margaret had driven downtown to pick up a gift for Richard's upcoming birthday. Walking past a restaurant, she noticed a familiar figure sitting near the window. Richard was there, laughing, leaning toward a much younger woman. Margaret froze. Her heart pounded. She watched as her husband held the woman's hand across the table. It was not a casual touch. It was intimate. Margaret felt the world tilt around her. She wanted to burst into the restaurant and demand answers, but something stopped her. She turned and walked away, her body trembling. She drove home in silence, her mind racing. Questions flooded her thoughts. Who was this woman? How long had this been going on? Had her marriage been a lie? That night, Margaret said nothing. She observed Richard closely. He acted normal, as if nothing had happened. He kissed her cheek, spoke about his long day at work, and went to bed early. Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling something dark grow inside her. The following days were spent in quiet investigation. Margaret went through Richard's belongings, searching for signs she had missed over the years. She found receipts from expensive restaurants, jewelry purchases she had never received, and hotel reservations under his name. The evidence was undeniable. Her husband had been living a double life. Margaret's emotions shifted from heartbreak to rage. She had given Richard 20 years of her life. She had been loyal, supportive, and loving. Now she felt like a fool. The betrayal burned inside her, turning into something dangerous. She decided to find out more. Margaret followed Richard after he left for work. She watched as he drove to a quiet neighborhood, parked outside a modest house, and walked inside without hesitation. Margaret sat in her car, gripping the wheel tightly. This was her husband's secret. This was where his lies led. As the sun set, Richard finally emerged, kissing the woman before getting into his car and driving away. Margaret's hands shook as she took pictures. She had proof. She had answers. But she also had something else, an idea forming in her mind. The betrayal had destroyed her. Now, she had to decide what to do next. Margaret spent the next few days consumed by her thoughts. The anger that had taken root in her heart grew stronger. She could not allow Richard to humiliate her. She could not let him continue his deception. She had given him 20 years, and he had repaid her with betrayal. She began planning carefully. Margaret knew she could not act impulsively. Every step had to be calculated. She continued her routine, pretending nothing was wrong. She cooked meals, attended events, and kissed Richard goodnight. Inside, she was crafting a plan that would make him pay. Margaret started gathering more evidence. She followed Richard whenever she could, taking pictures and noting times and locations. She searched their financial records and traced money transfers that led to an unknown account. She learned the woman's name, Jessica Reed, a paralegal working at a downtown law firm. Margaret studied her, learning her habits, her schedule, and where she lived. She rehearsed different scenarios in her mind. Could she confront Richard and Jessica together? Would she expose him in public? Or would she choose something more final? Margaret's patience wore thin. She could not eat or sleep without imagining Richard's betrayal. Her fury became an obsession. One evening she found herself holding a kitchen knife, running her fingers along the blade. The thought of making him suffer flickered in her mind. She shook the idea away but knew she was capable of something drastic. She considered other options. Poison was too risky. An accident could be too obvious. She needed a plan that would ensure Richard's downfall without suspicion falling on her. One night, Richard announced he had a business trip coming up. Margaret smiled and encouraged him to go. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for. As he packed his bags, she mentally reviewed every detail of her plan. Richard left early in the morning, carrying his suitcase and a travel itinerary. Margaret watched him from the doorway, waving goodbye with a calm smile. The moment he was out of sight, she got to work. She had prepared everything the night before. She took out the disposable gloves, the change of clothes, and the burner phone she had purchased weeks ago. She waited for later in the day to carry out her attack. Margaret drove to Jessica Reed's house, her hands steady on the wheel. Her heart pounded, but her mind remained sharp. She knew exactly what she had to do. Jessica's car was in the driveway. Margaret parked a few houses away and walked toward the house, taking careful steps to avoid drawing attention. She had studied Jessica's routine. She knew the woman was home alone. Margaret knocked on the door, and moments later, Jessica opened it, her expression turning to confusion. Before she could react, Margaret forced her way inside, slamming the door shut behind her. Jessica stumbled back, fear flashing across her face. Margaret's movements were swift. She had brought a syringe filled with a sedative she had bought from a medical supply store. Jessica barely had time to resist before the needle pierced her skin. Within seconds, her body went limp. Margaret dragged her unconscious form to the couch, her breaths shallow but steady. She had no intention of letting Jessica live. Margaret took a deep breath, pulled out a sharp knife, and completed her mission. The room was silent except for the sound of her own breathing. The anger that had burned inside her for weeks had finally been unleashed. She cleaned the scene carefully, wiping down surfaces and disposing of evidence. She planted clues that would lead investigators in the wrong direction. A staged robbery, a missing purse, a shattered window. It had to look real. Before leaving, she took Jessica's phone and sent a final text to Richard. It had to appear as though Jessica had planned to meet him but was attacked before she could. Margaret left the house, disposing of the gloves and knife along the way. She drove home, her mind still racing. The first part of her plan was complete. Now, she had to wait and see how the police would react. The crime scene was discovered the next morning when a neighbor noticed Jessica's front door slightly ajar. The police arrived within minutes, securing the area with yellow tape as detectives assessed the situation. The body of Jessica Reed lay on the living room floor, a pool of blood staining the carpet beneath her. Detective Jason Briggs, a seasoned investigator with over 25 years in homicide, examined the scene with a critical eye. He noted the broken window, the scattered belongings, and the missing purse. It looked staged. Something about the disorder felt unnatural, too calculated to be the result of a panicked criminal. The forensic team worked swiftly, collecting fingerprints, fibers, and surveillance footage from nearby houses. Jessica's phone had been found on the floor, screen cracked, with the last sent message showing a text to Richard Dawson. That single message caught Carter's attention. It read, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Love you." Richard Dawson was now a person of interest. Briggs requested a background check on Jessica Reed and found something intriguing. She had no known boyfriend and no history of past relationships linked to Richard Dawson, at least not publicly. But phone records told a different story. Dozens of late-night calls, secret meetings, and money transfers between Richard and Jessica suggested a hidden relationship. With this new lead, Briggs called Richard Dawson for questioning. Richard was reached at his hotel where he was supposedly attending a business conference. When he was informed about Jessica's murder, his reaction was one of disbelief. He claimed he was devastated, that he had no idea how something like this could happen. His alibi was solid. Several colleagues confirmed seeing him at a networking event the previous evening. Still, Briggs wasn't convinced. The detective then turned his attention to Jessica's personal life. He spoke with her coworkers, her friends, and even the barista at her usual coffee shop. Everyone painted a picture of a woman who had been deeply in love but had started to show signs of distress in recent weeks. Jessica had confided in a close friend, mentioning that she had grown tired of waiting for Richard to leave his wife. She had given him an ultimatum to leave Margaret or end the relationship for good. Briggs noted this detail carefully. A lover's ultimatum often leads to dangerous decisions. The detective then turned his focus to Margaret Dawson. He requested an interview, knowing that the spouse was always an important piece of the puzzle. Margaret arrived at the station looking composed, dressed in a simple navy blouse and slacks. She answered Briggs's questions with steady confidence. She claimed to have no idea about Richard's affair. She said they had been married for 20 years, and while things had changed over time, she never suspected anything. Briggs studied her body language. There were no signs of nervousness, no hesitation in her words. But something about her calm demeanor unsettled him. It was too perfect. He had interviewed enough suspects to know when someone was hiding something. Margaret provided her alibi effortlessly. She had spent the entire evening at home, watching television and making phone calls. The detective made a note to verify those calls. As the forensic team continued their analysis, they uncovered an inconsistency. The staged robbery had been too neat. The window had been broken from the outside, but glass fragments were found near the exterior, rather than inside the house, an indication that the break had been faked. This small detail shifted the narrative. Briggs now believed that Jessica's murder had been personal, carefully planned to appear random. The deeper he dug, the more questions surfaced. Why had Jessica's phone been left at the scene? Why had her last text message been so conveniently timed to incriminate Richard? And most importantly, who stood to gain the most from her death? Margaret Dawson's name lingered in his mind. Briggs wasn't sure how yet, but he had a strong feeling that Margaret knew more than she was letting on. The detective reviewed the growing case file with a sharp eye. Jessica Reed's murder had initially seemed like a random burglary gone wrong, but inconsistencies in the evidence had started to shift his perspective. The forced entry looked staged. The glass from the broken window had fallen outside instead of inside, a common mistake made by those trying to fake a break-in. Briggs leaned back in his chair, rereading the forensic report. The victim had been subdued with a fast-acting sedative before being killed. This detail stood out. Most burglars wouldn't take the time to incapacitate their victims with medical precision. This pointed to someone organized, someone with a personal motive. Margaret Dawson remained on Briggs's radar. She had presented herself as the devastated wife of Richard Dawson, a man who, according to phone records, had been deeply involved with the victim. Briggs knew betrayal often led to violent emotions. He had seen too many cases where revenge disguised itself as grief. The detective began methodically dissecting Margaret's alibi. She had claimed to be home alone at the time of the murder, making phone calls. Briggs had his team pull phone records. The calls existed, but something felt off. They were all made to automated systems, customer service lines, and recorded banking services. It was a weak alibi, one that could be easily fabricated. Briggs sent officers to gather surveillance footage from street cameras near Jessica's house. If Margaret had been there that night, he needed proof. A breakthrough came sooner than expected. A camera from a gas station 2 blocks from the crime scene had captured a black SUV matching Margaret's car driving past at the estimated time of the murder. The footage was grainy, but Briggs was confident it was her vehicle. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to keep digging. He ordered a forensic sweep of Jessica's house again, instructing his team to look for any trace evidence that might have been overlooked. A single blonde hair was recovered from the crime scene, different from the victim's dark brown strands. Briggs requested DNA testing. If it matched Margaret, the case would take a new turn. Meanwhile, Richard Dawson remained in the spotlight. His alibi had checked out, but Briggs wasn't convinced of his innocence just yet. A man capable of lying to his wife for years could easily hide darker secrets. Briggs's instincts told him that Margaret Dawson had a role in this murder. The challenge now was proving it. The cracks in her perfect alibi had begun to show. Now all he needed was to break them wide open. The detective and his team had spent weeks combing through evidence, determined to solve Jessica Reed's murder. The crime scene had been carefully staged, but inconsistencies stood out. The forced entry looked deliberate, yet there were no signs of struggle. Jessica had been subdued before she died. A breakthrough came when forensic experts identified traces of a rare sedative in Jessica's system. The drug was difficult to obtain and typically used in medical procedures. Investigators tracked an illegal purchase by a group downtown. This single detail placed Margaret under scrutiny. Briggs reviewed security footage from nearby buildings. A blurry figure was seen approaching Jessica's house on the night of the murder. The posture and gait suggested a woman. Further analysis of traffic cameras showed Margaret's car in the area at the time of the crime. Phone records revealed Margaret had contacted Jessica using an untraceable burner phone. Bank statements linked her to a suspicious transaction used to acquire the sedative. The evidence was stacking up. Briggs brought Margaret in for questioning. She remained composed at first, denying any connection to Jessica's death. But as the detective presented the mounting evidence, her car near the crime scene, the drug purchase, the financial links, her calm exterior began to crack. Faced with undeniable proof, Margaret broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed. She had discovered Richard's betrayal, followed Jessica, and confronted her in a fit of rage. The argument escalated. In a moment of fury, Margaret had used the sedative to subdue Jessica before staging the scene to look like a burglary. The case had been solved. Margaret Dawson was arrested, and her 20-year marriage was shattered by betrayal and revenge. Margaret Dawson sat in the interrogation room, her hands trembling as the weight of her confession settled in. The reality of what she had done now consumed her. The anger that had driven her to murder had faded, leaving only regret and fear. Detective Jason Briggs observed her closely. He had encountered many criminals in his career, but Margaret was different. She had been a woman scorned, betrayed by the man she had devoted her life to. But the law did not recognize betrayal as a justification for murder. Richard Dawson arrived at the police station hours later, his face pale with shock. The detective led him into a separate room and presented the evidence against his wife. Richard's expression remained unreadable as he listened. He had lived a double life for years, deceiving Margaret while maintaining his affair with Jessica Reed. Now, his choices had led to tragedy. His mistress was dead, his wife was a murderer, and his own future was uncertain. News of the crime spread quickly throughout Brookfield. The community was in disbelief. Margaret had always been known as a kind and respectable woman, active in social circles and community events. No one could have imagined the darkness that had consumed her. Reporters gathered outside the police station, eager to cover the shocking case of a wife's revenge. Margaret was formally charged with first-degree murder. Her lawyers prepared a defense, arguing temporary insanity fueled by emotional distress. The prosecution, however, had built a strong case. The premeditation was evident. Margaret had stalked Jessica, purchased the sedative, and planned the crime meticulously. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence that Jessica had provoked her. It was not a crime of passion. It was calculated. The tragedy had unfolded in layers: secrets, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. If Margaret had confronted Richard instead of letting her rage consume her, none of this would have happened. Now, a woman was dead, and another faced a lifetime behind bars. During the trial, Margaret showed little emotion. She listened as witnesses recounted her life, her actions, and the pain she had caused. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before delivering their verdict: guilty. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Richard walked away from the courthouse a free man, but forever marked by the events that had transpired. He had lost both women in his life, one to death, the other to prison. The scandal ended his career, forcing him into isolation. No amount of regret could undo the past. Detective Briggs closed the file on Margaret Dawson. Another case was solved, and another tragedy was recorded. Justice had been served, but no one had truly won. The secrets hidden behind Brookfield's elegant homes had been exposed, leaving behind nothing but sorrow and loss. Thank you for listening to True Crime Pulse. Share your thoughts on the story. Like and subscribe to the channel. Until the next episode, when we bring you more crime stories from around the world, stay safe.